We're starting a new unit on the Civil War, what leads to the Civil War, and we've been building up to this for over the course of several decades from the early 1800s. We'll look at the war itself and then the reconstruction that happens after the war to try and reunify the states. But we left off in the last unit at around 1850, 1852. And there is a great deal of political tension resulting from the Compromise of 1850. Now, you remember the great compromiser is Henry Clay, and he is exhausted. He's old, and he's exhausted from all this compromising. So he leaves the Whig Party sort of in the hands of his protege, Stephen A. Douglas. He is a senator from Illinois, and you remember the major parts of the Compromise of 1850. California is a free state, that the Utah and New Mexico territories will get to use popular sovereignty to determine whether or not there will be slave states, and the Fugitive Slave Act. And this was possibly the most controversial aspect, that slaves could now be captured if they had escaped. They could be captured across state lines and returned to their slave owners. And all that was required to say that someone was an escaped slave was if someone would testify. And so this now terrifies free blacks throughout the North. Stephen Douglas, after the Compromise of 1850, he is interested in not only benefiting the country, because as a Whig, they're looking at national policy, but he's also going to be interested in benefiting himself. And we'll see in a moment why this becomes so important in relation to what happens with these new territories. Another thing that happens in 1851 and 1852 is the publishing of a book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe published this first as a serial, sort of like A Tale of Two Cities was published, week by week, chapter by chapter. But in 1852, the weekly installments are finished and it is published as a full book. And this becomes the most popular book, just behind the Bible, of the 1800s. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, she comes from a family of abolitionists. Her father was a pastor, and she had experienced personal tragedy. Her son had died, and she realized that what she was experiencing and her husband dying from sickness was probably only a little of what some of these slave women experienced when their children were torn from them and sold to other people. So she writes this fictionalized account of a group of slaves. All of them are connected to this central character of Uncle Tom. And the sort of generalized storyline is that Uncle Tom tries to escape, but ends up being sold to someone down the river, down the Mississippi. He's sold to a sort of friendly family and becomes friends with their daughter, and they bond over their shared Christian faith. But then there are also these horrific characters of slave drivers who only want to work their slaves to death or use them essentially as concubines. And it does create some stereotypes that still kind of exist today about blacks. But what's important to history is that so many people read this, including people in the South. People in the South believe that this is an unfair portrayal. They believe that it is all lies, that it is libelous and slanderous. But the people in the North are really intrigued that, wow, is this really what the South is like? Is this really what slavery is like? Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe did base these characters in some way or another on first-hand accounts she received from slaves that she had met in Ohio, runaway slaves. So there is absolutely a kernel of truth to these storylines. But also, it is a romanticized, melodramatic story. And so the Southerners do have some basis in saying that this is an inaccurate portrayal. But what this does is it gets people throughout the country talking about the issue of slavery. This has been pushed under the rug for a long time. People have talked about other issues instead of talking about slavery. But this book, this popular book, gets people talking about slavery. And slavery is a big issue when we get to the election of 1852. There are several political parties who are putting forth candidates. Of course, the Whigs, but also the Liberty Party, the Know Nothings, the Southern Rights Party, the Free Soilers, and the Democrats. They put forth a candidate no one had ever really heard of, Franklin Pierce, and we call this the dark horse candidate. Well, he's from the North, he's from New Hampshire, and he wins the vote. He is not pro-slavery or anti-slavery outright. He ends up spending more time talking about these Western territories, which is how we'll come back to the Compromise of 1850 in a moment. In his inauguration, he talks about how foreign relations are very important, as well as new territories. And he says in his inaugural address, quote, "The policy of my administration will not be deterred by any timid forebodings of evil from expansion." And he is tiptoeing around this issue of slavery, because the real question with all of these new territories, what will happen to them? Will they be free or slave territories? Of course, you have to consider, though, the economic issues of these new territories, and that's a huge reason why the Gadsden Purchase is completed. The Gadsden Purchase, that the southern part of Arizona and part of New Mexico is added, and this is to help build a transcontinental railroad. The existing territory taken with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was not entirely hospitable to building this railroad, and just this little portion of land purchased by the U.S. in the Gadsden Purchase makes the transcontinental railroad construction more of a possibility. This plays into what we talked about with Stephen Douglas. He wants to benefit the state of Illinois, and for him, that requires a transcontinental railroad that would go through these central territories. But the problem is, not all of these territories are official territories or states. And that brings us to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed, and it is making the Nebraska Territory and the Kansas Territory, as you can see there in the center, it is trying to pave the way for this transcontinental railroad that Stephen A. Douglas wants so much. We had already established with the Compromise of 1850 that Utah and New Mexico could use popular sovereignty to determine whether they would be slave or free states. The Kansas-Nebraska Act also extends the issue of popular sovereignty to these territories. So meaning that the citizens, the people living there, will get to vote, will this be a slave or free territory? This doesn't seem to be a problem at first, except that slavery is now such a huge issue with North against South that the Northern abolitionists and Northerners who are afraid of the political power of the South, they encourage people to move to Kansas, to settle there and be able to vote in those elections. In the South, they are a bit more underhand, and they sort of pay people to go into the Kansas Territory just on election day and sway the vote. And this leads to a series of conflicts which are called Bleeding Kansas. People get into fights because this is now not just about the politics. This is about the politics of expansion and the slavery issue in expansion. Some people start shipping rifles into the Kansas Territory, and these were nicknamed Beecher Bibles. Henry Ward Beecher, father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, was a pastor and an abolitionist, and so these Beecher Bibles are rifles intended to help people who wanted to make this a free territory. This also is going to encourage the creation of a new political party. The Republican Party, the same Republican Party that exists today, has its foundations in the mid-1850s around this issue of slavery. This new political party, and it's taking followers of other parties, from the Whigs, from the Democrats. The Republicans want free soil, free labor, and free men. And so the Republican Party we have today is created here in the 1850s. A man by the name of John Brown is one of these abolitionists who went to Kansas and who used physical violence to try and get his point across. But this is not just an issue amongst the citizens. Even our nation's leaders are getting violent. And that's what happens in the case of Charles Sumner and Preston Brooks. And we watched several videos in class, but this is the story of Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner delivering a very inflammatory speech about the South, calling out slaveholders, and Preston Brooks, the representative from South Carolina, taking offense to both his state and things that were said about his second cousin. And Preston Brooks beats to a pulp Charles Sumner with a cane. So even in our houses of government, the issue of slavery is we can't hold it under wraps any longer.